The ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel glowed beneath enormous crystal chandeliers, their light scattering across polished marble floors and expensive suites. Tonight was my father's celebration dinner, marking 40 years since he built Hartwell Financial into one of the most respected investment firms on the East Coast. Investors, politicians, and CEOs filled the room, laughing loudly and shaking hands while waiters carried trays of champagne through the crowd. At the center of the attention stood my brother Daniel, confidently telling another story about his latest deal while our parents watched with obvious pride. Daniel had always been the golden child, the future of the company, the one everyone expected to carry the family legacy forward. Me. I stood near the edge of the room in a simple black dress, listening quietly while people assumed I had chosen a smaller life. My mother approached first, greeting me with a quick air kiss before glancing over my outfit. She smiled politely, but I could see the judgment in her eyes. She had always believed appearances mattered almost as much as success. My father followed, swirling his glass of scotch before asking the same question he asked every time he saw me. He wanted to know if I was still running my consulting thing, the small project he believed I had started after leaving the family firm. I told him it was doing well, which made Daniel laugh loudly enough for nearby investors to hear. He repeated my words mockingly and joked that doing well probably meant I had finally found enough freelance clients to pay rent. Several guests chuckled politely, unsure whether they should laugh or stay silent. I simply smiled and took a sip of champagne. I had heard variations of the same joke for 3 years. The funny thing was, the more they underestimated me, the easier everything became. 3 years earlier, I had walked out of Hartwell Financial after Daniel publicly questioned my judgment during a board meeting. Instead of defending me, my parents had suggested that maybe finance just wasn't the right field for me. They told me I had always been more creative and that there was no shame in stepping away from something that didn't suit my strengths. What they didn't understand was that I hadn't left because I couldn't compete. I left because I had realized something they hadn't. The financial world was changing faster than traditional companies like Hartwell could adapt. Data analysis, machine learning, and predictive algorithms were quietly rewriting the rules of global finance, while companies like my father's still relied on instinct and reputation. I didn't leave the industry. I simply decided to build something new inside it. Across the ballroom, Daniel continued entertaining the crowd with another story about a major acquisition he had just finalized. He proudly announced that Hartwell had purchased a smaller analytics company earlier that week for nearly $200 million. According to him, it was a brilliant strategic move that would help the firm stay competitive in the technology space. The investors around him nodded approvingly, impressed by the size of the deal. I almost smiled. If Daniel had spent less time celebrating headlines and more time studying the technology he bought, he might have realized that the company he had just acquired was already outdated. But Daniel had never cared about technical details. He loved big numbers, big applause, and big announcements. Meanwhile, I had spent the last 3 years quietly building something that would make those announcements look very small. My phone vibrated softly inside my clutch. It was a message from Ethan, the strategist who had been helping me coordinate tonight's announcement. Everything was ready. The press release had been scheduled, the markets were prepared, and the investors who had been working with me were already watching. I looked around the ballroom again. The giant screens behind the stage displayed old photos of my parents during the early years of the company. Guests were laughing, glasses were clinking, and the entire room felt like a celebration of stability and tradition. No one here realized the financial world was about to shift in a way none of them expected. Daniel eventually walked over to where I stood, still enjoying the attention he had been receiving all evening. He placed a hand on my shoulder in the way people do when they believe they are offering helpful advice. Loud enough for several nearby guests to hear, he suggested that if my consulting business ever struggled, there would always be a small position waiting for me at Hartwell. Maybe I could manage smaller client accounts or help with administrative projects. I thanked him politely, which only made him smile wider. My father nodded approvingly and repeated that family should always support each other. The irony of that sentence almost made me laugh out loud. Then the screens behind the stage suddenly flickered. At first no one noticed. The slideshow paused and was replaced by a financial news broadcast. Conversations slowed as guests began reading the headline appearing across the massive display. It announced the launch of a new artificial intelligence investment platform that had secured $12 billion in global assets within its first week of operation. Curious murmurs spread through the crowd as investors tried to understand what they were seeing. Then another headline appeared beneath it. This one announced that the same platform had just finalized a strategic acquisition involving several major portfolios that previously belonged to Hartwell Financial. The room fell silent. My father stared at the screen in confusion while Daniel immediately pulled out his phone to check the market updates himself. My mother looked around the room as if expecting someone else to explain what was happening. She quietly asked who the company behind the announcement was. I set my champagne glass down and answered her question. They hadn't heard of the company yet, I explained, because it had been operating privately while building its infrastructure. But they were about to hear about it everywhere. Daniel read the next headline on his phone and his expression changed instantly. The news report had now revealed the name of the company's founder and CEO. My father's glass slipped from his hand when he saw it appear on the screen behind us. For several seconds none of them said anything at all. Daniel finally shook his head and insisted that the report had to be wrong. He said there was no way I was running a technology company that size. I calmly explained that the reason he hadn't heard about it was because it had never been publicly connected to me. My phone vibrated again as the markets began reacting in real time. Financial analysts were already discussing the platform's predictive AI system, which had been outperforming traditional investment strategies across multiple markets. Major institutional investors had begun shifting billions in assets to the system within weeks of its launch. And earlier that evening, several of Hartwell Financial's largest clients had quietly signed contracts transferring their portfolios to my company. My father looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time in his life. Daniel demanded to know how something this large could have been built without anyone in the industry noticing. I told him the truth. The reason he hadn't noticed was because he had never considered the possibility that I might be building something important. By now the ballroom had grown completely silent. Guests were whispering to each other, checking their phones, and some were already recording the moment on camera. Investors who had been praising Daniel just minutes earlier were now staring at me with a very different kind of interest. My father tried to suggest that we should continue the conversation privately, but I gently shook my head. For years everything about my career had been dismissed quietly behind closed doors. Tonight, I said, it felt appropriate for the truth to appear just as publicly as those dismissals had. Daniel insisted that moving a few investment portfolios didn't make someone powerful. I calmly explained that I hadn't just moved a few portfolios. I had also spent the last 18 months purchasing Hartwell Financial shares through several private investment groups. Then I showed him the numbers. 42% ownership. The words spread through the room like electricity. Several guests gasped audibly. My father stared at the screen of my tablet while Daniel looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Before either of them could respond, the final headline appeared across the ballroom screens. The broadcast confirmed that my company had just secured controlling influence over Hartwell Financial. The empire my father had built over 4 decades wasn't collapsing. It was evolving. And the person guiding that evolution was the daughter everyone in this room had spent years underestimating. I picked up my champagne glass once more and raised it toward my stunned family. I congratulated my parents on 40 successful years. Then I calmly reminded them of something they had never bothered to notice before. The quiet person in the room is often the one building the future.